kindergarten, all the way through high school, graduating in 1939.
And you would like to let Barry just introduce himself now, and then we'll begin to talk about it.
He went through from kindergarten all the way through, but I don't remember when he graduated. He graduated in
1965.
65. Okay.
All right. Would you both just tell us what you remember about the school, what it meant to you, maybe some of your unpleasant memories too, what you wish could have changed or how it did change, because we've got a generation gap here. Jim, what do you remember?
For me, I don't really remember unpleasant parts of the school. I was very happy here, and as I walked over here, I thought of how we used to lay out here in the grass out by the Bell Building and between periods. I can remember this classroom right next door here where Mrs. Campbell had us doing our diaries and so forth. Boy, they were simple, but they were diaries. We put something in them every day, you know.
Do you remember some of your teachers that are vivid to you?
Mr. Alexander, of course, very vivid. Miss Campbell, Mrs. Jennings. I thought we were going to drive her crazy over in the junior high, you know, but she survived. So did we. And of course,
Well, what were some of your favorite subjects?
oh, I guess for me, woodwork, silver. Barry went for the clay more than I did.
And do you remember who your
And
instructors
the sports,
were?
jumping and all that stuff, we were real active in that. We didn't have a football team, but we had a good basketball team.
Well, you know, Mrs. Johnson didn't approve of football. She
I
didn't
know.
believe in contact sports.
Well, basketball is contact sport. Find out
It's
when you
got
play
rough
it.
now, but in those days it wasn't that bad.
But we beat, let me see, our senior year was, we beat public school 2 out of 3 games in basketball. And that highlight of our basketball career.
Jim, you went on then to college, did you?
Went on to Auburn.
Did you have any problems? Did you felt that you were not qualified academically when you got into Auburn?
I didn't do well in algebra the first semester. I took it over the second and had about 97 on it. Just missed something right off the bat. English, I waded through that all right. That's what everybody said. If you went to Auburn from organic, you'd have trouble with English. But I got on through that okay.
When you, at your time, did you have to have entrance examinations to get into the colleges? We did not.
I don't remember.
When I graduated.
You did, didn't you? Mm-hmm. Barry had to take the ACT test, as I remember.
Did you have any examinations, Jim, when you were going to organic? Were
Not
you
that I
graded?
recall.
No.
I don't think so.
Now you seem to stress the activity periods that you remember most vividly. You see, in today's public school, this is what we're missing throughout the school. You probably didn't realize, but Mrs. Johnson had that all programmed, so to speak, because you'd have an academic subject, and then you would have an activity subject. That was planned. That's the reason you didn't have time for study periods. We never had a study period. We didn't have homework either, except till we got into high school, and we didn't have homework Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. That was all planned for the development of the whole time for the social adjustments and all. So that was what I would call programming without the students being conscious of it. Now, Barry, did that programming idea continue through your years?
Sure, I think so. I'm thinking that when you're a kid, nothing seems unusual. An organic school certainly didn't seem unusual. Now that I have children of my own in different school systems, I realize this place was really unusual. And maybe we were sort of on the fringe, but when you're a kid, it's just, that's what you grew up with. It didn't strike me as unusual to have a sweet, jolly old lady, Miss Bell, who'd stay up all night watching kills fire. That didn't seem odd to me. That's really sort of an odd person, I suppose, or an interesting person. But when I think back of what it was like going to school here and what the student body was, because I remember the school home and the South American students who were in here, you know, boarding students. That's probably fairly unusual, but it didn't seem odd. It seemed perfectly normal at the time. And I regret that my kids don't have that opportunity.
Well, this is what the museum's all about, because we've documented her philosophy in writing. And I'm very, very happy about that, because we know today that education is in a mess.
Sure, and of course, as children, what the philosophy was, who cared?
Yes.
We were going to school where our parents sent us, and that was as much as it was involved to a child. And I suppose the philosophy is something that you just, I don't know, it's hard to say. Did we come here because we would, which came first, I don't know how to phrase it. Were we here because we would fit in, or did we fit in because we were here? I don't know, which you sort of, maybe we acquire the philosophy or I think open-mindedness is what comes to my mind. I don't know, I think we were just maybe more accepting. Maybe we didn't feel any pressure to be something that we weren't, or better at something that we didn't do well at, or that I sense in a lot of the other school systems. I think you just acquire it, you don't think about it.
Well, of course, Mrs. Johnson believed in self-competition. She didn't want us ever to feel pressure of competing with someone else. So that was one strong point of why we weren't graded. And I think that in itself stimulated your interest. And remember, she used to say, whatever you do, just do your best. And you weren't graded for any other reason. But as teaching later on, as substitute, I was never really on faculty. I was always here, it seemed like, because I was needed. And I don't know whether you two realize, but as teachers, we had to write reports on every student. And it wasn't a yes and no deal. So we had you all cataloged in a sense. And the parents weren't even, they weren't available to the parents, because Mrs. Johnson used to say sometimes in anger, a parent, or in appreciation what a child was doing, they'd say, now, wait, Johnny, you better behave because I saw the report on you. Or, oh, darling Susie, you have really done well. So she denied that to the parents, unless they came with a real request that I must see how my child is doing. And I don't think you as students ever realized that was going on.
Are those evaluations still at hand? Available?
They were burned, unfortunately. One year
They were
they were burned, yeah, which was very sad. A lot of our books were burned. So they're not available. But the schools, the universities in those days, were writing Mrs. Johnson and saying, send us some more of your children because they know how to think. And I think that was a key point through it.
I don't doubt that, and I think we get a lot of that simply. There were 8 in my senior class. I mean, there's a lot more thinking to do when there's 8 of you than when there's 35 of you sitting around, the teachers just trying to get the work done and get through the day. It seemed like it was much more relaxed. Now, I don't know if that was the philosophy or if that was because there was only 8 of us or for whatever reason, but it's a good way to be, I think, in school.
Well, how do you both of you feel, do you think this would be an impractical philosophy to put into our public school systems today? You mentioned about numbers.
I think it's an expensive philosophy to have a teacher-pupil ratio of 1 to 10 or 1 to 15.
But what I mean is, could it be, the philosophy still be used and have 35 to a group?
I don't know. I remember so much just one-on-one. And I don't know if that's part of the philosophy as it's written down, but I just remember that as being a big part of it. We all knew the teachers and they knew us. They just knew who we were and where we went when we left school and where we came from when we came in the mornings. And there was so much parental involvement that I remember in the later years. I have had a child in the public school system. We don't right now. But in a school of 800, 900 people, 30 people would show up for PTA. Here in a school of 100 people, 100 people would show up. I mean, it's just, I don't know if it's because those people were drawn to the idea or if that's just, I don't know which came first.
Well, Mrs. Johnson established that early on. Parents were really requested, almost demanded, to come to what we call roundtable meetings. And they were interested, or they wouldn't have put us into this unusual school because it was
And paid the
unusual.
money.
I don't think the parents could accept the system in the public schools. Too many of them would feel like they wanted their child to be visibly excelling in something through tests and so forth, you see. I just wonder if they would tolerate the system. I think it's a wonderful system. One thing I was going to point out that I think is really significant is that if any of us ever even thought of a drug of any kind, we didn't even know what drugs were. Never heard of them. I mean, it just wasn't in the vocabulary. It just wasn't a part of it. I think there were only 8 in my class, something like that, when we graduated. But we just didn't have that kind of problem.
Well, Jim, we didn't have drugs as we know them today, but we had alcohol,
I suppose.
and we had premarital sex. There probably, maybe you two weren't exposed to that or know it, but then as a teacher later, around campus, I was very aware of what some of this was going on. And one address I remember making to a bunch of educators, a group of educators, and I opened my address by saying, because I had been told, oh, here comes this, old fiddle-duddle, and things are different today. And I remember opening it by saying, I want you all to know, even though my age is thus and so, that in my day, we had drugs, because we had alcohol, we had tobacco, and we had sex. And that sort of got their attention. But how do you feel about, as you noticed up here, this one saying from Mary Johnson, prolonging of childhood is the hope of the race. Actually, that's not original with her. Rousseau said that.
I think that's true.
And could you both feel that perhaps this is part of our problem of what they're doing in our kindergarten children? That could be correct.
I don't know. I don't know if that's a problem with the school system. I see a lot of my children are in private school now, and they wear a uniform. Some years ago, I might have thought that was a little heavy-handed, but it makes so much sense to me. And the public school should have uniforms, because when they're in the public schools, I got to have a pair of Guess jeans, and I got to have a pair of. I mean, it's a very competitive. I don't remember us as children, and we may have because children do that, having to be that sort of competitive and having to have what everybody else was. We were coming to school barefoot. I mean, it was great. But there's a lot of that in the public school system now. I think uniforms would change that. It brings everybody back to the same level, which I think is probably good. It gets a lot of the clutter out of the way, so we get on with the business of learning instead of trying to one-up and outdress and overdo each other.
You realize, though, even in Mrs. Johnson's day, we did discuss dress codes.
Oh, I'm sure. There's nothing new under the sun.
And this is what she used to say to us, because you see, so many of them in the school home came from wealthy families, and they could have really put on the dog, so to speak.
Put on the airs.
Yeah.
I don't remember what foreign country I was in, but I was impressed by the school children wearing uniform, but of a different color for different grades. That was.
Well, this was nice, and I don't like the idea for different grades because that sort of pinpoints you. If it were life classes or if the 6-year-olds wore whatever, and in different colors. But she used to say when we discussed dress codes, she wanted, and in one instance I remember one girl being sent home because she was what Aunt Nettie termed indecently exposed. That wasn't unusual. But she wanted creativity within your dress, and she definitely spurned the idea of a dress of uniform. And she used to say, I wish men would wear more color. For goodness sakes, they wear color now. She said, clothes should be, they should not inhibit the body, but they should be comfortable and they should be colorful and they should be pleasing. And I do think that's a wonderful thing, but like you say, in masses, I don't know that you can achieve that without going into uniforms.
Yeah, I guess not. And then I remember when I came back and was teaching here for a while, 20 years ago. Hair was, of course, the thing. It's always been the thing. Always will be the thing. After 40 years, he thinks I now have a sensible haircut, but it won't last. And it's always something like that. But back when I was in school here, it just wasn't it wasn't a problem. Children tend to be cruel to people who are different. But as I remember, you had to be really different before you were even noticed, it seems like, and then we might have been a little bit cruel, but we weren't. It didn't seem like we ganged up on the different ones especially, or we just seemed to be much more, it's not like we consciously accepted them, they just were, and they were different, that's just, so what, who cares?
You probably weren't conscious of this either, but with purpose, Mary Johnson brought in, because she knew her classes would be small, even though it was open, free to the community children. But there was a stigma with the public school, heavy thinking, and a lot of the original families here still didn't take to the idea. But she, with purpose, she brought in a physically or mentally,
different people.
yeah,
I remember
one
some
to a
of them
group.
well.
And she taught us, she wanted us to have empathy. And I don't know, the groups were marvelous about that. They really kept the self-esteem. And I remember in Jeffrey's group, there was a great big clumsy boy, and he was awful in basketball. But he wanted to play so badly, and they had a wonderful team that year in basketball. And so as they saw they were going to win, they'd bring him in that last quarter, which of course brings the score way down, but they just would yell for him and they just encouraged him. And he says to this day, you can't imagine what that did for me, for my self-esteem.
Which certainly is the case
It
now.
wasn't to win. It was this, and I think that permeated a lot of our activity.
Now it's the winning that gets the emphasis. But I was thinking too about in public and in a lot of the private schools now, the classes are more divided up on ability. And I wonder is that for the benefit of the student or for the benefit of the teacher? I don't know. The educational system says it's for the benefit of the students. I kind of think it's maybe to make the teacher's job easier. I don't know, but when you've got 35 people in your class, you need everything you can do to make it easier, which is, of course, a problem with the public school system.
In the thinking too with organic, are you both happy that you were exposed to the activity periods to the extent that we were?
Oh,
folk dancing, all of
Oh, man.
It always amazes me when people, when we used to call us the basket weavers and that sort of thing, and put us down for having any of the artistic advantages that we did, whether it was the clay or, but it's carried over in my life. It's still one of my favorite things to do is to be involved with the pottery or the metal and the music. And I don't know to what extent that exists in public schools because I'm not associated with it now, but I don't know of anybody who's carrying over any of that into their later years, and I find a lot of joy in it.
Well, within our own county schools, and I guess Mobile County too, they're bragging now because the children are getting one art class a week, either music or art, one class a week. And there again, it's structured. Stay
Yeah.
within the lines sort of thing in your drawing.
Yeah, I used to come early and stay late just to be with Miss Bell.
Miss Bell.
Yeah.
Miss Irene.
Jesse Irene.
Talking about art, gosh, we were getting all kind of art. We had clay,
Yeah.
silver, leather, woodworking, of course, and making the plaques out of plaster tires. You know, we did those things.
Well, I used to like to come to school early in the morning to go help her, and then stay after school to help her. And I don't know if it's because I was so intensely interested, which I was, but she was available too. It was like the door was there, and just come on in and let's do it, you know. And I run into sometimes now at the school system, if you want to talk to the teacher, you have to make an appointment through the secretary and all that stuff, and it's distancing. It just makes it harder and harder. It puts more distance between people, I think. And I think it's too bad.
That was part of the structure or the thinking of school too. Even though classes were over always at 3.
Yeah.
The science building was open, the crafts building was open, the shop was open.
A lot of us didn't leave.
Typing was open, and you had to leave at 5. Lots of times we didn't even want to leave at 5 o'clock.
And how are you going to work that in the public school system when she says, but I have a contract that says that I be here at 8, I leave here at 3, and you don't bother me after that.
Well, that even,
I'm putting in my hours and I'm getting my salary, and that's what the union says, and that's the way it is. And
yes, that is part of our big problem.
maybe those people should be.
And the children feel that.
Oh, well, of course they do. It defines them.
I think more parents would be involved if they felt they were making any inroad to correct it. I think
I
they
think
get
so.
discouraged.
And when you think back of the facilities we had, such as transportation, I don't remember what kind of a rickety old bus we had, but Kenny would load us up in it, our basketball coach or dear party husband, we loved it. But he'd load us up in that thing, we'd go off to here, there, and yon. Imagine the liability exposure nowadays.
Couldn't do
You
that.
just can't do those things. But we'd get there and we'd get back.
Everybody's suit-minded now.
Everybody wants to go on a suit. I remember when our folks, we used to have Saturdays where in fact, we painted this building once, we whitewashed
Oh,
it. And it was the parents up here replacing windows, and it wasn't a question of whether or not it was air conditioned. It wasn't air conditioned. But they were willing to come up and work on the building, and it seems like parents now, particularly public school parents, all they want to do is protest, is demanding this and that and this for the school. Don't raise my taxes, don't expect me to pay for it, don't expect me to come swing a hammer, just do it. And it obviously is not working.
No, and just pouring more money into than you feel is not the solution. It's participation of those.
Well, of course, the parents, they simply have to be involved in their children's education. Maybe our high schools are just daycare centers, public schools.
So how do you feel about private schools? Do you feel that what we really need is a good, free, so to speak, public school education throughout the United States?
Sure, I think you've got to make education available to all. People are just going to have to say, let's pay for it. And people are going to have to demand, as they're beginning to, accountability. Teachers should be tested. If they're not doing the job, they shouldn't have the job. Why should an ineffective or a bad teacher be allowed to ruin 1,000 children just because the union's behind them? I mean, it's bizarre. What's more important here?
It's a very strong union now.
It's the tail is wagging the dog. But yes, it needs to be rethought, and it needs to be examined. And I think accountability is what's missing.
Well, how do you feel, though, about when you say teachers should be tested? Sometimes, and I'm sure you found it in your experience of teachers, those who maybe have the highest degrees and could take a test academically and come out 100%.
Got a good point there.
Cannot teach, do not really love children. Do you realize when Mariette Johnson interviewed someone that wanted to teach, even though she knew where Charles Grable was coming from, he was coming from Harvard, but what she said to you first, a question. She put those beautiful brown eyes on you and she'd say, do you love old children? And I'm afraid that a lot of our teachers really don't love the children. And I think that's the first requisite for teaching. You can't fool a child, can you? They know whether you care or not.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think I don't know, it's a big problem, and I don't know if it can be.
I don't know what the solution is.
It might have to all
But
crash before it can be rebuilt.
But you're both happy that you went to the organic school.
Oh, very much.
That's
apologize for it at all, you know. People say, well, you went to Puganic. You remember when you used to call it Puganic?
Oh, yeah, and in the public school. Yeah, and you
No,
looked
that's
up.
great.
There was a lot of animosity in there. Jim, back to the business with you and Barry. Give us a little background on Gaston Motor Company.
Well, of course, Dad got in the taxi business up on the corner in the middle of town where the building still stands. In fact, the old shop building, which now houses Andre's Wine and Cheese, was built in 23. And, you know, I believe it's still got the original corrugated tin roof on it, too.
Really?
But he signed with Ford in 1923 as a dealer. He was selling cars for other dealers, but he wanted to get a direct franchise. And it has operated continuously ever since then. I came into the company on a permanent basis in 46 after I got out of the service and was married. And then I became the dealer in 62, I believe, as Dad began to phase out. And Barry, you came permanently. What year did you come in?
Can't remember. After a couple of years of teaching and doing different
Yeah.
things.
Peace Corps for 1 year.
Yeah, different stuff.
Yeah, and then Barry became the dealer about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
About three. He is the dealer now.
So that's 3 generations. And
So
the
it's a
business
third
goes strong.
generation business that still survives.
But you had to move out on the 4-lane by the Ford dictates.
Yeah, we just about had to. We didn't
Not by Ford dictates,
Not by
just
Ford.
that's,
if we
that's the way
wanted
business
if we wanted to stay competitive and do well.
And it would have been wrong for the way Fairhope was going to have Gaston Motor Company on
right
that
in the
main
middle of
corner
town.
downtown.
It was a wonderful corner, but it's not the best place for a dealership.
No. And Barry, I think you married an organic school student.
Yeah,
graduate.
we talked the other day
High school
about
sweetheart.
what a thrill it was to ring the bell, how it was like when it was
By
your
the way,
day to.
before you leave it, I'm going to ask you to ring it today.
Was in fact, this was Ms. Werner's classroom, and I think it was when you got to the 6th grade, you got to ring the bell.
Don't use the word gray. Third line.
Third line, this was Ms. Werner's. And Stevie said she remembers once when they went out and rang the bell at the wrong time, just for the heck of it, and all the classes start changing and everything. Kind of bowed up today. But ringing the bell was
Somebody
a big
always
deal.
used to manage to get to the bell on Halloween
Oh,
too.
didn't we though?
Steal it or flip it or do
Yeah.
anything to it. Yeah, it's fun.
Well, you know, the bell that we have now is not the old school bell, which broke my heart. But the organic school per se would not release it. And so we went a-hunting, and a-hunting we did go. And I'll give you a sheet of the history of the existing bell. It's the only bell that I know of, and anyone else that I've talked to, that has a cue ball for a clapper.
That'll work.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the history of that is in writing, is out there framed by the bell itself.
I really missed the old arts and crafts building. I thought that was just such a wonderful building with those enormous swing-out windows. The big
The
high
history of the
ceilings.
arts and crafts is probably one of the saddest on campus. And before you go, I want you to see the original that Franklin Johnson, see, he died in 1919, that he had us as students, not I was before my time, but he had us, and we have a picture of it, of building the original shop. Because the high school building, which is now Dogwood Assembly Hall, was the first shop building. Did you all realize that?
Mhm.
That was the one that was built after we outgrew the 3 wings here in the Bell Building. And then we needed more classroom space. So he constructed this, and we have a picture of the first wing being built, and then a picture of the whole thing. Now that was a wooden structure of 3 wings out to the north of this building. And Miss Bell was firing the kiln and got it so hot it exploded, and that
Burnt it.
building was burned.
Burnt it down, I remember
And
that.
then the tile building
You're-
went up. Now that's the building that Kenny and I wanted so badly to save because it had such
Wonderful.
good memories for various generations. Tom Jones just grieved terribly
I
over
was
it.
in the town
I'm
building.
looking at the clay storage bin over there.
That was the original.
My house has shrunk over the last 35 years. because we used to just could barely reach in it. Remember how we would almost fall in to get the clay out?
I salvaged that
It's
before the
wonderful.
bulldozers
I
came
remember
in.
that well.
Yeah,
But Lord,
I
it used to come up to here. You know?
Yeah.
But my class had woodworking in the tile building.
Yeah,
Sure did.
yeah.
And
Well, when
clay.
Ken and a
Sure.
couple of competent builders looked over the tile building, because they was talking about raising it, they realized that there was nothing in that building that could really be salvaged. Even the big beams were gone.
Hmm.
So there was nothing any good of it except.
The old shop building used to be almost right out here,
Mm-hmm.
because the grass would never grow there.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And so that's sadness to me.
Yeah.
But that's one building that I realized had to be torn down. But the other buildings, no, I think that was sad. That we lost, we had 10 buildings, and the only two that are left of the original is the old high school building, Dahlman Assembly Hall, and the building. And those are the two that we have restored.
Typing building and prof shack.
Yes.
Oh, remember the old shack over here that Ollie Taylor
Yeah.
taught English, and
Wonderful
it was just an absolute shambles.
Marvelous teacher and a cursing son of a gun. He walked up and down and cursed, and yet he was a very good teacher, and he was very loyal. Do you realize his last year teaching, he would not accept 1 penny from Mary
Really?
Johnson? No. He was very dedicated.
He was he was a good teacher.
He
like
was a
you
good
say.
teacher. He was and a very dear.
There were a lot of them oddballs by today's
Yeah,
standards, but they didn't.
right.
It was just them at the time. They were just interesting and fun people. I don't know.
I don't think they would have come to us as they did unless they were looking for something different than what was going on even in education in those times. And they became very dedicated when they came. Yeah. Do you both remember, Barry would remember, Charles Rebo was gone, but Jimmy, you remember Charles Rebo and folk dancing? Probably not. You were very young when
I
he was
remember
killed.
Mr. Frederick vividly, of course.
Yeah, in the shop and teaching.
I wondered today if he must have had a blood pressure problem. We
Oh, he
must have
could be.
given it to him because
He
he
could
really
be.
did
Well, he could be
upset with
violent,
us, you know.
but he was,
But by George,
but he was a
that
good
folk
teacher.
dancing was a good class, and I remember when we borrowed George Fuller's station wagon, and he drove us up to Washington D.C. when we danced in
Demonstrate.
Constitution.
Yeah. We did.
And
some-
we danced in Constitution Hall.
But
My class did.
Did you?
Yeah, you know, and I'm thinking that the folk dancing probably got us more ridicule from the public school
Yes.
kids
Yeah, that's
than,
right.
than anything. But we went to Washington and danced on Constitution Hall for the National Folk Festival. How many other 8th graders got to do that? It was wonderful. We'd go to White Springs for the folk festivals, and
Yeah.
old Thelma Bolton, Spinner Tales, and different groups would be. I mean, it was.
So the folk dancing
It was
really
like
hung
the-
on, and they did well with it.
Well, you learned group discipline, you learned rhythm, it was just
It
good.
was very social in the right way. Mrs. Johnson was very strong on that point. And do
And
you
it
all
was a very-
realize about the financing of the school before it had tuition? That Mrs. Johnson solely did that, and through her lectures, see, she went to Europe to lecture. And Kenny remembered her in New York at the Armory giving an address, and she was the third speaker. And it was just packed with people, and through the first 2 speakers, there was noise and confusion. And when Mrs. Johnson came out and onto the platform, she just stood there, you know, she has a wonderful poise, and just quiet. And Kenny said, all of a sudden a hush went through the entire Armory in New York City. And he said she spoke for 15 minutes, and she had them just absolutely spellbound. Now that's how she got money to keep the school going, other than the volunteer and the cooperation. You see, because there was no tuition. I guess they were charging, Barry, in your day, were they? Was there tuition?
Yeah.
See,
Not
that
much.
briefly when they started that, and they kept going up.
Yeah.
It was quite expensive now, I understand.
I don't know. My class was graduated in '65, and a lot of us had been together since kindergarten. And so we were really, I guess, organic students, whatever that was. We were just been here a long time, and there were a few grades below us that were coming along that had been together for a long time. And that was kind of special to go all through your school as part of the same group, you know. New ones coming in and going out. There were some of us who were still very good friends to this day.
I think most of my class,
Went right on through.
all of it.
And then when I came back to teach here for a while was when the Civil Rights Act had been passed, and for a lot of reasons, most of them wrong, a lot of people were wanting to get their kids out of public school, into any private school. It didn't matter, just don't want it public. And the way I've always viewed it is that this school then needed the money. And they took in a lot of people who probably shouldn't have, not a lot, I don't know how many can a lot be, who probably shouldn't have been here because they weren't here for an organic education, they were here for a non-public school setting. And when I was teaching and I had the arts and folk dancing and science and math, it was parents saying, my kid's not doing that dancing crap. It should, you know, it impacted the school terribly.
Yeah, that began to pull the school really down.
It began to pull it down. All of a sudden, it wasn't open and accepting. It was.
They were using it simply as an excuse to avoid integration.
Yeah, it was.
Public school.
And at that time, I remember I was begging the organic school to take in some blacks.
It would have fixed that problem.
Right, and they refused to sit on the board. Absolutely not.
Well,
I said, Mrs. Johnson would be begging him to come to that.
People would have been here for the right reasons instead of the wrong reasons, and it was just a group of circumstances that set it up that way. But all of a sudden, you had parents who were almost anti-organic education. They just weren't going to. My kid doesn't have to do that if he doesn't want to, sort of a thing. And that was just real unfortunate.
We didn't make that noise.
I remember how we used to do all the yard work ourselves, and in my class, in this classroom, we picked up pecans for months and months, all the pecan trees, to raise the money to buy new lights. This is sort of a...
We used to look forward to the days that we'd get to go out. I'd get an old truck borrowed a truck from Dad, and we'd go out and chop wood, bring it into the school.
That's how we heated the rooms.
Yeah.
Do you remember ever being too warm or too cold in these rooms? I don't.
No, I'm sure we were, but we used to huddle around the heaters. I mean, but we were comfortable then.
And now to think that they're not going to send Susie and Johnny to school that isn't air conditioned.
Exactly.
Oh, boy.
And do you realize the reason for the 10 buildings all over the campus and not one great big economical building, so to speak? And if you think of what the public school or schools are doing now with your children, they're coming into kindergarten and sometimes they go all day into almost sunset without even seeing the sky. And the grounds are so limited to play on. And this was again planned so that you had this 5 minutes to go from building to building, to have that release and that break.
Shake out the wiggles as much.
I remember Mrs. Johnson saying to us in teachers training, listen to the recess periods. And you could hear the public school at that time, which was there on the corner of the church and Nichols. And listen to the recess or the playtime of the organic students. And we became conscious of listening. And the public school had a high-pitched scream, which was sort of like you let out an animal out of a cage and in his wildness. And the organic school would be a joyous, noisy affair, but it had a whole different tone to it. She made us very conscious of that. See, we'll water under those pressures to get that release. A wonderful, wonderful concept. And again, I want to say to you all that this is what the museum is all about, is that we have the writings, we have tapes, such as you all are doing, and we have artifacts. We wanted to make our room as pleasant as possible, so the people that came in that knew nothing of it. But what we're trying to do is encourage educators and parents and teachers to come in and get materials to study. Because something can be done about education if we all care enough.
Well, you've obviously put an awful lot of effort in it.
Oh, yeah. Kenny would be so proud today. That was some of the last things he said to me. Dottie, you will get the museum finalized. You must. And it's been a labor of love. We're not nearly through. And I don't know how much more time we have. Buddy? But this has been a good interview. You all touched on the things that we really wanted to hear. Have we had more time?
Have we anything more to say?
Well, let's go on, because I think this is just great what they're telling us. And we're not only talking about their memories, but we're talking about what maybe education could do. These are the things that make me happy. Bob Smith, who you know, Barry, he is principal. He's vice president of the museum board. He's principal of Old Shell Road Elementary School. And this is his second year of a grant that he received from the state of Alabama to introduce into his school kindergarten through third grade, strictly through the arts. And they allowed him to have a magnificent faculty of all the various things. Everything I named he seemed to have covered, except maybe big rooms of weaving or whatever. And then, unfortunately, the children will be evaluated at the end of 3 years. And if they come up to academic standard, he might be given a grant for another 3 years. And the magnet school over there that takes up from his third grade, as I understand it, has gotten very interested. In fact, one of the teachers from that school came over and said, "We're so impressed with what Mr. Smith is doing, we want to carry the program on into the school." And Bob said the difference in the attitude of the happiness of the children last year and this year is just remarkable. They seem to be so happy. And the whole thing is introduced now through art, regardless of what the subject is. And so I think that in itself is a big step forward. Now, whether or not the state is going to continue to let it exist, but we are making some strides. And then again, I hear stories that just very exciting to me what's going on in kindergarten. They're actually grading them, and they're told, teachers are told that what their duty is to teach them to sit, which is a tragedy.
My children are in private school, in all different grades, senior, 7th grade, 1st grade. The 1st graders not too much, but the others know where they rank.
Mm-hmm. Very conscious.
They know which group they're clumped with, whether it's they just know who's the slow learners, who's the fast learners, they know who's who in there. They know the structure, the hierarchy, and that's really very sad. I hate it. It breaks my heart to know. It doesn't matter what group they're in. They either know they're in the advanced placement, am I the smart kids, or we really those the slow kids over there, or.
And they don't take into consideration what I call the slow learner. And sometimes we find that the slow learner is the one that goes the furthest in whatever their pursuit is. They just don't recognize this, do they?
A situation that recently developed in Baton Rouge, was it, where this woman hired,
Texas
hired someone to kill her neighbor so that her daughter could win
Cheers.
Yes.
shooting. Now a situation like that could never have arisen here.
No.
It just wouldn't be. There's not that intense competition. We competed with one another, but nothing in that.
Nothing in that, no. And I'm sure both of you being here now.
But there again, that's why I say I don't think the parents could go along with this philosophy in a public school, because they would maybe be too intent on knowing exactly where their child stood in the group.
Mm-hmm. And don't you see why Mrs. Johnson said even those records are not available to the parents? But where we have to start then, wouldn't you think, is it might be too late for the parents of today. But if we can bring the children into this philosophy, and hopefully some of the parents that are interested, and the teachers, that finally we will teach, just like we're telling our children and teaching our children how not to litter, because the parents still are going to litter to a point. So we do have to start very, very young.
It's kind of like trying to espouse the single tax theory among politicians today. I mean,
Landholders.
It makes too good a sense.
Well, there again, it's the almighty greed in the dollar, isn't it, in that instance? And in the competition, who are we competing with? They say the world market. But the United States has always been known for its ingenuity and its creativity. And do we want to turn all of our youth into robots? Would without thinking. And the present educational system is pretty much doing that.
They don't call them institutions for nothing, I suppose. It's a small tribe. I'm glad I had this place. At the time, it was nothing. It was no big deal. It was nothing special.
And yet you
Looking back, it really was quite special.
And yet, in your business, I can't think of a more competitive business than Gaston Motor Company, and you handled it beautifully, and yet you came up in this system.
Managed to survive in spite of our education.
And you're doing beautifully, because I think you're probably thinking it through real well and have the ability to do just that.
Might be a good time to.
Okay, well, I want to thank you both. You've given
It's a
us
pleasure.
It's been a wonderful interview. And we'll just let you see your own tape here in a minute. See how it turned out.
That might be a shock.
I think it'll be fun. And I'm very, very happy about that, because we know today that education is in a mess.
Sure,
Something
and of
wrong.
course, as children, what the philosophy was, who cared?
Yes.
We were going to school where our parents sent us, and that was as much as it was involved to a child, and I suppose the philosophy is something that you just, I don't know, it's hard to say. Did we come here because we would, which came first, I don't know how to phrase it. Were we here because we would fit in, or did we fit in because we were here? I don't know, which you sort of, maybe we acquire the philosophy or the, I think open-mindedness is what comes to my mind. I don't know, I think we were just maybe more accepting, maybe we didn't feel any pressure to be something that we weren't, or better at something that we didn't do well at, or that I sense in a lot of the other school systems. I think you just acquire it, you don't think about it.
Well, of course, Mrs. Johnson believed in self-competition. She didn't want us ever to feel pressure of competing with someone else. So that was one strong point of why we weren't graded. And I think that in itself stimulated your interest. And remember, she used to say, whatever you do, just do your best. And you weren't graded for any other reason. But as teaching later on, as substitute, I was never really on faculty. I was always here, it seemed like, because I was needed. And I don't know whether you two realize, but as teachers, we had to write reports on every student. And it wasn't a yes and no deal. So we had you all cataloged in a sense. And the parents weren't even, they weren't available to the parents, because Mrs. Johnson used to say sometimes in anger, a parent, or in appreciation what a child was doing, they'd say, now, wait, Johnny, you better behave because I saw the report on you. Or, oh, darling Susie, you have really done well. So she denied that to the parents, unless they came with a real request that I must see how my child is doing. And I don't think you as students ever realized that was going on.
Are those evaluations still at hand? Available?
They were burned,
Probably.
unfortunately. One year
They were burned.
they were burned, yeah, which was very sad. A lot of our books were burned. So they're not available. But the schools in the universities in those days were writing Mrs. Johnson and saying, send us some more of your children because they know how to think. And I think that was a key point through it.
I don't doubt that, and I think you get a lot of that simply. There were 8 in my senior class. I mean, there's a lot more thinking to do when there's 8 of you than when there's 35 of you sitting around, the teacher's just trying to get the work done and get through the day. It seemed like it was much more relaxed. Now, I don't know if that was the philosophy or if that was because there was only 8 of us or for whatever reason, but it's a good way to be, I think, in school.
Well, how do you, both of you feel, do you think this would be an impractical philosophy to put into our public school systems today? You mentioned about numbers.
I think it's an expensive philosophy to have a teacher-pupil ratio of 1 to 10 or 1 to 15.
But what I mean is, could it be, the philosophy still be used and have 35 to a group?
I don't know. I remember so much just one-on-one. And I don't know if that's part of the philosophy as it's written down, but I just remember that as being a big part of it. We all knew the teachers and they knew us. They just knew who we were and where we went when we left school and where we came from when we came in the mornings. And there was so much parental involvement that I remember in the later years. I have had a child in the public school system. We don't right now. But in a school of 800, 900 people, 30 people would show up for PTA. Here in a school of 100 people, 100 people would show up. I mean, it's just, I don't know if it's because those people were drawn to the idea or that's just, I don't know which came first.
Well, Mrs. Johnson established that early on. Parents were really requested, almost demanded, to come to what we call roundtable meetings. And they were interested, or they wouldn't have put us into this unusual school because it was
And paid the
unusual.
money.
I don't think the parents could accept the system in the public schools. Too many of them would feel like they wanted their child to be visibly excelling in something through tests and so forth, you see. I just wonder if they would tolerate the system. I think it's a wonderful system. One thing I was going to point out that I think is really significant is that if any of us ever even thought of a drug of any kind, we didn't even know what drugs were. Never heard of them. I mean, it just wasn't in the vocabulary. It just wasn't a part of it. I think there were only 8 in my class, something like that, when we graduated. But we just didn't have that kind of problem.
Well, Jim, we didn't have drugs as we know them today, but we had alcohol,
I suppose.
and we had premarital sex. There probably, maybe you two weren't exposed to that or know it,